Welcome to the Little Study. Today we'll take a look at a topical subject, Ukraine. While the area that comprises modern Ukraine has a long history, the state of Ukraine is relatively young. Some might say Ukraine only came about with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, but let's look a bit further back, to what could be considered the beginning of what we today know as a state. That would lead us directly into the First World War. The causes and start of the Great War is somewhat complicated, and in the beginning of the war there's really no Ukraine to speak of. When you look at a map from the time, it just says Russia and Austria-Hungary. Let's crack open the first layer of that map and look a bit closer. We can immediately tell that what is now Ukraine was split between two countries, Russia and Austria-Hungary. Since it's the lesser slice of the pie, let's look at the Austrian-Hungarian Empire first. Some people might not know what Austria-Hungary is. On a modern map, you'll see one country called Austria and another called Hungary. Well, back in the day, these two were the same country, united by their leader, the Emperor. And they were a big country too, consisting of Czechia, Slovakia, and about half of the Balkans. We're focusing on the northeastern part of this empire. This region was known as Galicia, also known as Austrian Poland. Wait, Poland? Yeah, this area was part of Poland, at the time called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. They had been the major mover and shaker in that area for a long time, but in the 18th century their power waned and they were completely partitioned. That is, their land was taken by the neighboring states of Austria-Hungary, Russia, and Prussia. Prussia is more or less what you'd call Germany now, and since it's a bit outside of the scope of our story, we'll just call them Germany. Sorry Russophiles, you'll get another episode on your own one day. Pinky promise. As you'd imagine, Galicia was full of Poles, centered around the city of Lvov, or Lemberg, as it was called in German. But isn't this about Ukraine? Don't worry, they're there too, but they're known as Ruthenians. From 1866, a general liberalization took place in Galicia, where the local Polish aristocracy gained limited autonomy in the Galician Sejm. A Sejm is the traditional Polish democratic system, like a parliament of sorts. This shift of power to the Poles didn't sit well with the other Slavs of the area, which were divided between the Ukrainophile Ruthenians, who looked towards Kiev and the local language as their defining feature, and the Russophile Ruthenians, who looked to the Russian Empire. At this time, Russia was one of only two sovereign Slavic nations, the other being Serbia. So for Slavs living in countries ruled by other groups, it's not strange that they would look towards Mother Russia. Austria-Hungary and Russia were not friends at this time, so the Russophile Ruthenians were seen as treasonous, and as we get to 1890, the Poles and the Vienna government is fully on the side of the Ukrainophile Ruthenians, now known simply as Ukrainians. This was a major victory for the Ukrainians, as now a full Ukrainization of the Ruthenians took place, and soon the Ukrainians were the dominant East Slavic group, vying for power with the Poles. The Ruthenians who resisted the Ukrainization still live on to this day, known as the Rusin. They still struggle to be free of Ukrainian influence. The Ukrainians still wanted further autonomy, and implored the Vienna government to split Galicia into a western Polish half and an eastern Ukrainian half. The area also saw something called the Great Economic Emigration, where almost 1 million people left Galicia for the New World, especially Brazil and Canada. This state of affairs would last until 1914, and that's where we leave our Austrian-Hungarian Ukrainians for now, and roll back and look at the people living in the Russian part of modern-day Ukraine, which is most of it. The area was known as Little Russia, and had been known as such for a long time. The northern part were divided into different gubernia, that is, a Russian administrative unit, and the south, which was conquered from the Tatars and Cossacks, came to be known as Novorossiya, or New Russia. The north was widely divided into the West Bank Ukraine and East Bank Ukraine, each on their respective side of the Dnieper River. The western side had been a part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the eastern part of Russia. But since, as we know, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was partitioned, the West Bank fell into Russian hands. The name Ukraine comes from the Slavic word Krajina, meaning borderlands. The area has a complex history with many different players on the field. In the late 19th century, the area was chiefly inhabited by a handful of groups. For starters, the Russians, at this point known as Velikorussia, Great Russians, and Malorussia, the Little Russians. Great and little in this context isn't meant as a comment on the people themselves, it was pointing to the surface area. The third group of Russians, the Belarusians, lived, unsurprisingly, in Belarus, north of Ukraine. Other groups were the Cossacks, the Tatars, the Jews, and the Poles. Romantic nationalism was on the rise in the 19th century, and it also became popular with the Little Russians living in the Ukraine. That is to say, the Ukrainians. We saw a similar trend in Galicia, but in the Russian Empire, things weren't going to be so easy. The Russian Empire forbade any publications in Ruthenian in 1876. The Russian Empire wasn't going to play ball, and the issue wasn't as simple as Ukrainians versus Russians. A lot of people saw themselves as Belarusian and not Ukrainians, and did not want a separate Ukrainian identity. They said that Ukrainian is simply a little Russian accent, but the Ukrainian hardliners supposed that Ukrainian is its own distinctive language separate from Russian. This came to be separated into a populist Ukrainian identity with the lower classes and elitist Belarusian identity with the upper classes. The Industrial Revolution didn't quite break through in the Ukraine. The only major propeller for growth was coal veins found in the Donbas Valley, and the only large cities were the old Kiev and the somewhat newly established warm water port of Odessa. A warm water port is a port that's operable year-round, and as such was vital to the Russian Empire. Odessa was actually the fourth largest city in the entire realm. Although the Ukraine remained as an agricultural area, it was not as bad as in Galicia. Many Ukrainians emigrated during this time, although unlike their Galician counterparts, they moved within the borders of their land, all the way to Manchuria, to an area they would call Green Ukraine. This area is commonly known as Outer Manchuria. It's the strip of land that Russia owns east of China and north of Korea. The rise of nationalism amongst the people of Europe had another consequence than the formation of the Ukrainian identity, namely World War I, aka the Great War. The full background and reasons why and how the war started is beyond the scope of our current goal, but from the flames of war, Ukraine rises. Let's have a look at the big picture. The two main players in our story remain the same: the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire, and their border lies along the Carpathian Mountains. Early in the war, Germany is pushing for a quick defeat of the French in the Western Front. Their forces on the Eastern Front are outnumbered and have taken a strictly defensive stance, allowing them to hit the French as hard as possible. The Russian Empire, allies of France, is obliged to attack Germany on their weaker eastern flank to put some pressure on Austria-Hungary, who has the brunt of her forces on the Eastern Front and is Russia's main rival in this conflict, is planning to go all out right away. The fighting is concentrated in Galicia, where the Austro-Hungarian troops have initial success. They drive back the Russian army somewhat, but the Russian command soon gets a grip and counterattacks. This counterattack crushes Austro-Hungarian armies, and they tuck tail and run all the way out of Galicia. The Russian Empire ruled the area with an iron fist, supporting the Russophile Ruthenians instead of the Ukrainians and Poles. Things weren't better on the Austro-Hungarian side either, where suspect Ukrainians were put in concentration camps. Most Ukrainians were fighting in the Russian Imperial Army after all. The Austro-Hungarians, along with their German allies, would however push the Russian Empire back, and eventually to its breaking point. in 1917, the Russian Revolution happened. After the Tsar abdicated, the Russian Empire became the Russian Republic, and it is collapsing fast. The huge power vacuum left by the imperial government was shoes too big to fill for the Russian democratic body, the Duma. The diverse peoples of the old empire, fueled by the raging nationalism of the recent decades, are calling for autonomy, and even independence. The Duma is quickly losing control, and the Great War keeps raging at their western borders. But that's only threats from without. The threat from within is even greater, and its name, the Bolsheviks. Eastern Europe is falling into chaos, and the nationalists in Ukraine weren't going to lose this opportunity. Russia was in a state of civil war, and Ukraine would be the so-called southern front of this war. The red, communist, and the white, loyalist armies would fight over the scraps of the old empire. But the runtime is already long enough here, so we'll save that for next time. Looks like this is going to have to be a two-parter. Next episode, we'll see Ukraine really come into its own. I hope to see all my strong, handsome, and independent listeners next time in the Little Study.